It seems like the government just declared war economically on the Australian people. Wow, that is a massive, highly provocative claim, right? And it's the exact conclusion reached in a recent episode of the Two Worlds Collide podcast. So let's actually test it. What exactly is driving such a fierce reaction to the new labor regime budget? Well, today we're going to look strictly at the numbers. We aren't here to take sides or debate the politics. Instead, we're going to objectively unpack the very specific financial figures and arguments the podcaster uses to justify the startling statement. Let's dive in. Welcome to This Explainer. I am thrilled to be guiding you through this breakdown today. Look, budget documents can be a total snooze fest. They're often hundreds of pages long, filled with so much economic jargon, it's like trying to read a different language, making it really hard to see the forest for the trees. But the Two Worlds Collide podcast isolates specific line items to build a very deliberate, focused narrative. Our goal today is to look directly at the numbers they've selected to see exactly why they believe this budget is literally an attack on everyday taxpayers. Okay, let's quickly check out our roadmap so you can see exactly how we're going to logically categorize these claims. First, the economic war claim. Second, community and domestic spending. Third, foreign aid and partnerships. Fourth, defense, veterans, and immigration. And finally, tax policies and the bottom line. All right, Section 1, the economic war claim, the core argument. The whole foundation of this critique rests on one big idea. The podcaster claims the new labor budget fundamentally prioritizes foreign and niche interests way over everyday Australians. From their perspective, the government isn't just mildly mismanaging funds. They are actively funneling taxpayer money away from the core population and redirecting it toward international aid, hyper-specific community subsets, and corporate interests. This is the thesis we'll be testing against the numbers they provide. Let's move to Section 2, community and domestic spending. Basically, where is the money actually going locally? Right off the bat, the podcaster contrasts two very specific multi-million-dollar allocations. We have $124 million directed towards Israel and Jewish lobbying groups, set against $25 million aimed at uplifting security for Muslim communities. The source uses these exact figures to question the government's targeted funding priorities, asking why such massive amounts of taxpayer dollars are being heavily siloed into specific religious and geopolitical subsets within Australia. But here's what's really interesting. The podcaster makes a super sharp observation about the broader domestic landscape. Amidst all these tens of millions of dollars being distributed, there is zero equivalent funding allocated specifically for Christian communities in the country. They use this $0 figure to highlight what they perceive as a glaring inconsistency, a total imbalance in how the government values and supports different demographics locally. And the critique of community spending definitely doesn't stop there. We're looking at staggering allocations aimed at combating anti-Semitism and hate speech. There's $200 million here, a $68 million block for national security and monitoring social media posts there, plus dozens of millions more through specific individual grants of $46, $41, and $9 million. The podcaster's counter-argument to all this, they say a completely cost-free alternative exists. Just enforce the existing watch lists. For instance, they argue that simply refusing weapons to individuals already on ACO watch lists would be a far more practical, inexpensive way to ensure security than spending hundreds of millions on awareness and social media monitoring. This frustration bleeds right into other massive domestic expenditures too. $300 million to end gender-based violence, $112 million for gambling addicts, $32 million for a social cohesion and public awareness campaign, and $24 million just to recycle solar panels. The podcaster uses these figures to suggest the government is basically throwing money at symptoms rather than root causes. Take that $112 million for gambling addicts, for example. The source argues a much simpler, significantly cheaper solution would be to just halt gambling lobbying altogether, rather than constantly taxing the public to clean up the fallout. Shifting gears, let's hit Section 3, foreign aid and partnerships. These are the international allocations. The source methodically tallies up over $1 billion heading overseas. Look at this. We have $550 million going to the Pacific and Timor-Leste for climate-resilient infrastructure. There's $330 million heading to Indonesia for general support, $167 million allocated to Nauru, and $25 million for India, mainly for strategic partnership grants and fellowship programs. The podcaster presents these staggering figures to directly question the logic of the budget. Their implicit question to the listener is pretty clear. Why on earth is Australian taxpayer money building infrastructure and funding fellowships abroad when there are such pressing economic needs right at home? Let's transition to Section 4, defense, veterans, and immigration. Priorities in question. First up, the Australian Defence Force, or ADF. The podcaster literally argues the government is, quote, coming after our veterans. They base this on the continuous funding of investigations into the military. The budget highlights a previous $300 million spent on Afghan war crime inquiries, and now it adds a new combined $104 million to continue investigating alleged war crimes, alongside another $16 million to investigate sexual violence in the ADF. To the podcaster, continually pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into investigating their own soldiers is a giant red flag of misplaced governmental priorities. And to compound that frustration, they highlight a specific $64 million allocation solely to recruit foreign nationals into the Australian Defence Force. The source points to this multi-million-dollar recruitment drive as a highly surprising reliance on foreign nationals for domestic defense, further pushing their narrative that the government is constantly looking outward rather than investing in its own citizens. So, the crucial point the podcaster pivots to next involves the immense financial burden of immigration healthcare and compliance. $450 million for RSV vaccines, $68 million for HIV treatment specifically for immigrants who aren't even eligible for Medicare, $27 million just to ensure migrant workers follow the law, and $10 million for community-led health literacy education for refugee and migrant women. The podcaster lists these millions to emphasize the immediate, massive cost that new arrivals are placing on the national budget. All of this leads the podcaster to ask one very pointed, blunt rhetorical question: who are we importing? They express deep, vocal frustration over funding treatments for pre-existing conditions like HIV and basic health literacy programs. From their perspective, an immigration program should be bringing in highly self-sufficient professionals, doctors and engineers, who contribute to the economy on day one, rather than individuals who require hundreds of millions of dollars in immediate healthcare and compliance support from the taxpayer. Finally, we reach Section 5, Tax Policies and the Bottom Line. This is really the economic climax of their argument. The podcaster sees this specific policy shift as the ultimate betrayal. Everyday Australians lose the 50% capital gains tax reduction, stripping the incentive to invest their own hard-earned money into shares, real estate, and commodities. Meanwhile, foreign billionaire corporations investing in Australia are granted capital gains tax-free status. For the source, stripping tax incentives from hardworking local citizens while allegedly giving a total free pass to foreign billionaires is the absolute proof that the budget does not serve the Australian people. To really hammer this systemic imbalance home, the source points to one stark number: $5,000. That is the strict cap placed on mental health services for a local veteran who needs psychologists, psychiatrists, physios, and doctors. When you place this $5,000 limit next to the hundreds of millions being spent overseas or on specialized domestic grants, the podcaster's outrage becomes fully contextualized. So that brings us right back to the framing quote of this explainer. It seems like the government just declared war economically on the Australian people. After viewing the podcaster's thematic breakdown, the specific targeting of domestic grants, the $1 billion in foreign aid, the hundreds of millions spent investigating veterans versus the massive outlays for immigrant healthcare, and finally, that stark disparity in tax policies, you can clearly see the structured foundation of their outrage. The podcaster isn't just throwing angry words around. They are actively using the government's own ledger to build their case. Which leaves us with the ultimate question. I challenge you to look at these numbers, analyze the data objectively, and decide for yourself. When viewing these exact allocations, do you see a government managing shifting, complex global and domestic priorities? Or do you see what the podcaster sees, a deliberate economic war on everyday taxpayers? The numbers are on the board. The interpretation is entirely up to you. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the data.